Hi, thank you so much for joining me. So we're here this evening to chat about the debut, The Rabbit Hutch by Tess Gunty. The lovely Tess has joined us. We're going to be chatting a little bit about the book, have a little reading, and just dive into the characters a little bit more. But Tess, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself and the book a little bit, just to kick us off, that would be great.
Yeah, thank you for having me. My name is Tess Gunty. This is my first novel, and it follows a group of characters over the course of 3 days, one hot summer, as their lives kind of violently collide. And even though there are lots of different characters, I think of the main character as Vacca Vale, Indiana, which is a fictional town that's sort of inspired by the town where I grew up, South Bend, Indiana, but also a number of other cities in the Rust Belt who have they've kind of been conjured into existence by industries and then very swiftly destroyed by those industries, and now are kind of across America just these kinds of forgotten economies, and the people who once benefited from the prosperity are now left behind. And so I wanted to write a book about the atmosphere of these places.
Yeah, I think this definitely captures that, and it's so funny to hear you talk about that and the inspiration about Vacca Vale because obviously I'm from the UK, but I actually grew up in a place that is kind of like the UK equivalent of one of those towns, and it's the same story of prosperous industry in the 80s, and now these towns have been left behind for decades. But yeah, I definitely could relate, I think, to a lot of the experiences going on throughout the book. But I love this idea of these characters violently clashing. I think the characters in this book are just absolutely fantastic. But if you don't mind, I'm kind of going to kick off with is it Blandine? Is that how you pronounce it? Or
She gave her name to herself, so there's no wrong answer, but I use the more French pronunciation, which is Blondine.
Blondine, love it. Okay. But yeah, I think so. The book kicks off, and I have to say, the beginning is it just packs such a punch. So we kind of learn that Blondine is exiting her body. We talk about the mystics, and then we have a bioluminescent man. I remember reading that first paragraph, and I read this book when I was on holiday. So picture the scene on the sun lounger, and I'm like, I'm hooked. I have no idea where this is going, but I'm hooked. I thought it might be a nice idea if we kind of have a little bit of reading about the beginning, and then we can kind of go from there and chat about that, if that's okay.
Absolutely. I'll just read the first chapter because it's very short. It's called The Opposite of Nothing. On a hot night in apartment C4, Blondine Watkins exits her body. She's only 18 years old, but she has spent most of her life wishing for this to happen. The agony is sweet, as the mystics promised. It's like your soul is being stabbed with light, the mystics said, and they were right about that too. The mystics call this experience the transverberation of the heart, or the seraph's assault, but no angel appears to Blondine. There is, however, a bioluminescent man in his 50s, glowing like a firefly. He runs to her and yells, "Knife, cotton, hoof, bleach, pain, fur, bliss." As Blondine exits herself, she is all of it. She's every tenant of her apartment building. She is trash and cherub, a rubber shoe on the seafloor, her father's orange jumpsuit, a brush raking through her mother's hair. The first and last Zorn automobile factory in Vacca Vale, Indiana. A nucleus inside the man who robbed her body when she was 14. A pair of red glasses on the face of her favorite librarian. A radish tugged from a bed of dirt. She is no one. She is Katie, the Portuguese water dog, who licked her face whenever the foster family banished them both in the snow because they were in the way. An algorithm for amplified content and a blue slushie from the gas station. The first pair of tap shoes on the feet of a child actress and the man telling her to try harder. She is a smartphone that films her as she bleeds on the floorboards of her apartment, and she is the chipped nail polish on the teenager who assembled the 90th step of that phone on a green factory floor in Shenzhen, China. An American satellite, a bad word, the ring on the finger of her high school theater director. She is every cottontail rabbit grazing on the vegetation of her supposedly dying city. 10 minutes of pleasure igniting between the people who made her, the final tablet of oxycodone on her mother's tongue. The gavel that will sentence the boys to prison for what they're doing to Blondine right now. There is no such thing as right now. She is not another young woman wounded on the floor, body slashed by men for its resources. No, she is paying attention. She is the last laugh. On the hot night in apartment C4, when Blondine Watkins exits her body, she's not everything, not exactly. She's just the opposite of nothing.
Wow, I have to say that actually is way more impactful hearing it after reading the rest of the book. That's incredible. What an incredible beginning. But yeah, I guess I'd love to know whether the beginning was something that you constructed before the rest of the book, or was it something that you went back to in the end? I'm always interested to hear whether you like wrote chronologically or not through the book, or
The beginning was something I wrote last, actually. It was after I had tried out 2 or 3 different openings to this novel. And the first one was a like a collective voice of the town speaking, which did not work at all. But that was kind of it was like a necessary mistake that then led to the next
yeah,
mistake that led to the next. So eventually I just decided not to try to write the beginning until the very end. And it's interesting, I think like endings and beginnings generally have each other encoded into them. So
yeah.
even the very ending of the book, I think was kind of encrypted by an early scene, not this one, but an early scene between 2 characters. So I tend to write the very beginnings of novels after I've finished them.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. And like I said, I think knowing what unfolds throughout the book, hearing your beginning, it just ties in so wonderfully, and it makes the references to everything that's to come. But yeah, I have to say, yeah, it just really resonated with me. Um, but yeah, I guess I know we've touched kind of on Vacca Vale and the inspiration of that, but was that like your initial inspiration for the book itself, or like what germ of an idea happened for this book to begin, I guess?
Yeah, I think it was a couple things colliding. In terms of the sort of content of the book and the subject matter, I had just left the post-industrial Midwest, my hometown, for the first time, and I'd moved to New York for a writing program. And so I'd been away from the city for about a year when I started writing this. And I found even during that year when I was living in New York, I couldn't stop writing about this place. It was like I would try to set something in New York and it would just be pulled back into the Midwest. And I had never been able to write about my hometown when I lived there. And I think that there's something about sort of leaving it and being able to see it more clearly, more objectively, and also more affectionately than I had when I was living there. I needed to be able to approach it with a kind of tenderness and also an awareness of its beauty, not just its kind of sense of entrapment, which was something that was quite oppressive to me when I was living there. So I realized that I kept being pulled to this place. I was really especially pulled to the kind of purgatorial atmosphere of the landscape. To me, I remember when I was maybe 10 or 11, I went to Catholic school and we had this teacher, this religion teacher, who taught us what purgatory was. And she defined it as a place of eternal longing and unquenchable thirst. And she's like, you never know when you're going to be released from it, and most people go there. And when she described it, even as a child, I thought, this sounds so familiar. It sounds like our town. And so I think this kind of there was a sort of afterlife quality to my hometown growing up. And I felt exactly the same sensation whenever I would enter a town that had a similar economic history.
Mm.
So that was the kind of I think it was just kind of an escalation of this place was almost brimming from my writing, and I needed to kind of look it in the eye and decide what it was that I needed to say about it. And then in terms of the structure, I had been reading a lot of polyphonic fiction at the time. Great House by Nicole Krauss, and Infinite Jest by Deborah Foster Wallace, and even A Visit from the Goon Squad by Jennifer Egan, and a number of others. And all of these books, one thing they have in common is that their main character is not a person, it's a place, an idea, a desk in the case of Great House. And so I realized that it was a very good form to use for a book whose main character was going to be this city.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, again, it's so strange to hear you talk about your hometown like that. I I feel exactly the same, and I have the same thoughts now as an adult, having left. But yeah, that really felt that throughout. But yeah, I guess so. If we're saying the kind of the main character is the town itself, how did Blondine come to, I guess, come to be? She's obviously an amazing, complex character, but yeah, I'd love to hear more about her journey.
Yeah, so she is the human protagonist insofar as this book has one. She's definitely the gravitational center of the novel, and all of the characters are sort of united by her in some way. Um, and I think it was actually my advisor. I had, I wrote this kind of for my thesis for this writing program. I wrote the first 100 pages of it or so, and the my advisor was a writer named Rick Moody. And I think when I had about 70 pages, maybe a little bit more, he pointed out that Blondine was the protagonist. And it was something that I honestly didn't even notice until he said it. And then it was so obvious. I didn't have to alter anything, but it was helpful knowledge when I was structuring the subsequent pages. And of course, when I was revising, I made an effort to make her sort of the relevant, anchor in every chapter. But she was all of these characters arrived to me with their most eccentric, extreme quality and nothing else. And so for her, I had this it was almost like a very clear vision of a kind of sleep deprived teenager in a parking lot. And she had a blue slushie, and she was wearing these kinds of oversized clothes, and she had white hair, and she had this kind of otherworldly glow to her. And I immediately thought, what if she wasn't particularly religious but wanted to be a mystic? And so that was the first thing I knew about her, and then I could see her very clearly. But the work ahead was to create someone who felt inevitable and real, rather than simply peculiar for the sake of it. I didn't want any of the characters to seem that way. And I think for Blondine was such a joy to write because she was a kind of heroine that I wanted to see. She was kind of relentlessly herself. She was devoted to her obsessions, her peculiarities. She wasn't afraid to do things that were unusual or different in her town. She also rejected the currency that I think women from a very young age, women and girls, are trained to view as the most valuable currency they can possess, which is physical beauty. And she's kind of offered this through no effort of her own, and she rejects the currency. She thinks, she kind of sees through it as a false currency. She sees the attention as more oppressive than liberating, and she sees that it's kind of, like all currencies, just a kind of widely agreed upon fiction that reinforces power structures at play. And so I wanted to write a character who was offered that currency and rejected it in favor of her intellect, her curiosity, her activism, her ethics. And she had such a ferocious curiosity. It was fun to write a character who was curious about everything and sort of socially a bit abnormal, but the way that she interacts with people is usually through the exchange of information.
Yeah, I honestly, she's probably one of my favorite characters that I've ever read, and I love this idea that she is almost slightly otherworldly. I definitely get that vibe from her, but I think one of the things I love is like her metamorphosis into this character of Blondine throughout the book. But yeah, talking about like her refusing the currency, I think some of my favorite scenes to read, even though they were quite hard hitting, was her later conversations with James Baldwin. Obviously, I won't talk too much about what happens between them, but I think those conversations where she just speaks so intellectually, and she, like you said, she's just so herself and so unapologetically herself. She just speaks what she means. She knows what she wants out of that situation, and it's to just be who she is and becoming this character. I just think it was so amazing to read, especially from a young character. Even when she's in the Rabbit Hutch and in the apartment, she refuses to kind of bend to the other characters and the other people that she's living with and surrounded by. So yeah, I think she's a great character. But yeah, I did love the fact that you said that the most eccentric qualities of all of your characters came to you first, because I was actually going to point out that I don't think I've ever read such a fantastic host of eccentric, complex characters before. But Yeah, it's fantastic. Like, I just honestly, I just love how you've managed to, I think sometimes you get this one eccentric character and then you have this host of characters that can kind of blend into the background. And I felt like reading all of these different stories that you just don't get that. They all have these, yeah, these eccentricities that are also odd in their own way. And I absolutely loved that. I think, yeah, I don't know how you pulled that off, but it was fantastic.
Well, I think I remember when I was first beginning the book, I had I was mostly writing in Prospect Park, which is this big park in Brooklyn, and I would kind of stay in there without my phone or anything, and I would write by hand and read. And I would almost always leave because of the heat. Eventually, the heat would get so intense that I'd have to leave. And I sometimes do think that a lot of these characters were like heat induced hallucinations or something, because they really were so clear to me. They
Yeah.
came to me so clearly, and yet they're all incredibly strange, and to me they were completely real. But yeah, that's never happened to me before.
I did love it. I think so even kind of like the more side characters I really enjoyed as well. So I think your inclusion of Elsie Blitz, and I remember quite early on you will read her obituary. And I remember sitting and reading that and thinking, like, this is fantastic. The way you kind of took on board that character and wrote it through, yeah, that like small addition and change in format. I really loved, but like, what was your inspiration to include her and her obituary?
Yeah, I think one of the perhaps advantages of writing so inefficiently, because I don't, as you asked earlier, if I write linearly, and I don't. I always write I write in sort of associatively, and then afterwards when I'm revising, I have to rearrange usually a lot of the material. But one advantage of that is that I tend to be led to places that I wouldn't have planned. And so in this case, I had heard an interview with someone who monitored obituary comments on this website for a living. It was someone who monitored the guest book for this online obituary. And I just, it was a short interview, but I couldn't stop wondering what that job would do to your brain over time, and how that would influence the way that you go about your days when you're not working. I think it was this blend of being immersed in this kind of sublime otherworldly realm where you're assisting people as they grieve, and then the supreme mundanity of the internet, and the kind of the trolls that you would inevitably have to face, and the robots and everything. Just the idea of this kind of sacred and profane world coexisting was really compelling to me. So first it was Joan that came to me, and then I realized that I had the opportunity to think about whose obituary is relevant in this case. And I was thinking really explicitly about American production, systems of production. Obviously, this was a region of America that had produced automobiles and had in many ways kind of manufactured a very American ethos of independence, car dependence, and a sort of suburban sprawl type of landscape that was dependent upon the automobile, that then took over American architecture and urban design. And so when I was thinking about that, I was also led to think about like the sort of factories that manufacture American dreams. And in this case, Hollywood is the one that's probably the most powerful manufacturer of American dreams. And sort of obviously we export many of those, I don't know, unrealistic sort of narratives. And I was interested in writing someone who's sort of benefiting ostensibly from the extraction economy. She's someone, Elsie Blitz has been famous since she was very young. She had a sort of an American dream type of life. Her mother was an immigrant. She was from a working class family. And then she became very wealthy and famous very young. And yet she's also suffering very acutely from the extraction economy. She has been, something essential has been extracted from her. She is the factory in this case. And that, so it, yeah, just gave me a way to think about the extraction economy from the perspective of someone who was ostensibly benefiting from it.
Yeah, it was really interesting. And I think it really contributed to when her son comes in as a character, and yeah, we get that connection. I think it really helped. Yeah, it really helped, I think, his character development. But yeah, So there's actually one of my favorite conversations that happens in the book is actually when her son speaks with Father Tim. And obviously, for those who haven't read the book, this character, he has a very strange hobby that he likes to carry out in revenge. Yeah, very, very interesting. Again, I absolutely love how eccentric most of the characters in this book are. It's fantastic. But he has a conversation with Father Tim, and they're talking about, I guess, what makes like a good or a bad person. And Father Tim talks about how being a whole person, you're neither, like no one person is good and no one person is bad, and they're all like, yeah, a series of contradicting behaviors. And I think that's something that really, yeah, it really broadened my lens, I think, for most of the characters as well. And I think I spent the rest of the book reading these characters as more neutral, and I think it really helped. But yeah, it was actually something I asked the people who were on the read along whether they agree with that, and it's just a really interesting concept. But I kind of get that from all of the characters in the book, that they all have these contradicting behaviors. But yeah.
Yeah, that's really good to hear. I mean, I think when you're reading a really good book or watching a really good show, for me at least, it doesn't even occur to me to morally assess the character. Like, I remember having this experience when I saw Fleabag. Have you seen Fleabag, the
Yeah.
show? When I saw it, I mean, I remember sort of reading a review of the first season about how like depraved the main character is, and it just never even occurred to me to morally judge her, because you're so immersed in her perspective, and
Yeah.
the forces that are acting upon her are so visible to you the whole time, that you know, if you stop to assess her behavior, you can see that it's damaging. But I think the best books, movies, plays, they show the forces acting upon a character. And so
Yeah.
even if you're not morally justifying their behavior, um, you're at least immersing someone in that kind of storm of forces that people are, because everyone's always responding to things that are, at least in the moment, persuasive to them.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely feel the same. You don't, yeah, especially with Fleabag, you don't really question the morality of her actions, and just you're kind of fully on board. But yeah, it's kind of nice to take that step back and actually think about the characters a little more in that way.
Mhm.
But yeah, really enjoyed that, and it kind of gave me a different perspective as well on, I guess, the other characters within C4 with Blondine, because obviously it kind of culminates in, as we learn at the beginning of the book, a very specific incident. And yeah, you kind of read throughout the book before you get to this instant the different forces at play. um yeah, it's really, yeah, a lot to think about, I think. Yeah, I guess I kind of would like to explore a little more as well, on the religion themes, I guess, weaved throughout. So obviously he talks a lot about Catholicism and mystics. This is actually something that was brand new to me when reading this, so I spent a lot of time on Google. But I'd love to hear about your process with that, and whether you had to research something that you were knowledgeable about beforehand.
Yeah, so I was raised in an extremely Catholic context. My household was very Catholic, and then I went to Catholic schools for most of my life, and most of the people I knew were Catholic. And so for me, it was almost just this kind of native language that was offered to me. And I think I was always, my mother was in a convent at one point, and my dad was seriously considered the priesthood. But even they had this kind of attitude toward Catholicism as it was sort of accidental. Like, we were born into this was the religion of our ancestors, but it is not inevitable. They had a more universalist sort of attitude toward religion generally, as most major religions sort of contain the same ultimate truths. And so I grew up, by the time I was 15 or something, I was rejecting the religion pretty vehemently. But I found that the access to that language was sort of like having access to a particular art theory or a particular literary critical theory. It's just another sort of language of interpretation, a lens through which you generate meaning about the kind of mundane signs and signals in the world. And so when I was writing the novel, I think I was very surprised to see Catholicism appearing without the kind of bitterness and resentment that I felt toward the church by then. And I think that it could only be possible because I was writing a character who wasn't raised Catholic, who kind of stumbles upon this culture because it's the culture of her town and she's exposed to it. But growing up, I was always very intrigued by the female mystics because obviously it's a very patriarchal religion, and you're not offered a lot of kind of women in the church to look up to throughout, especially not throughout history. But what was different about these kinds of, especially the kind of medieval female mystics, was that they were almost feared by the men of their time. And they had this like otherworldly, almost witchy kind of supernatural power. And even as a child, that was so compelling to me, the idea that a woman could transcend all of this kind of these oppressive forces of her context through some kind of ultimate divine connection, and be sort of privy to secret revelations that then she has to to spread. That was just I thought that there could be no better occupation than that. And so I knew of a few of these mystics, and I'm calling them mystics, you know, you can kind of call them lives of the saints, who claim to be mystics. And then Hildegard came to me because when I was researching the ones that I knew, she just kept coming up. And so I started researching her, and she's the heroine of my heroine. For those who haven't read the book, she's very important to Blondine, and her writings feature heavily throughout the book. And so, or at least they influence Blondine's psychology a lot. And so when I started reading about Hildegard, I was so captivated by this kind of, she's just such an incredible kind of firecracker of a historical figure. She was this, she was born in 1098. She was the 10th of 10 children to this kind of noble German family, and her family donated her to the church as a tithe, which used to be a common practice among large families. And so she grew up from a young age in kind of seclusion in this abbey. And she, by the time she was in her 30s, she was kind of leading her own group of women. She became this kind of force of change within the church. She was this educational force. She was a polymath. She invented a language. She was the founder of natural history in Germany. Some consider her to be. She wrote a medical text and music. So she was this kind of ferocious genius that had talents not only in organizing and sort of political intelligence, which she used to her advantage, but she also had this voracious curiosity that I found very compelling. And one thing that was also very compelling about her is like a lot of these kinds of female Catholic mystics, none of the ones who kind of make it into the church as officially recognized saints are that subversive, really. You know, at the time, people were not afraid of excommunicating people. There was a lot of persecution from Rome for very, very mild offenses within the church. So none of them were that radical. But Hildegard adopted, I think the other women in the church tend to adopt this extremely passive, sort of submissive tone, even in their religious writings, but Hildegard does not. She does sometimes put it on when she's kind of trying to butter up a certain member of the male clergy or whatever, but she, in her spiritual writings, she's just so ferocious and confident. And that was, it was a delight to behold that in a medieval woman in the church.
Yeah, it was so fascinating to read about. And like I say, as someone who's never been exposed, especially to that depth of knowledge about the mystics, I absolutely loved reading about her and just how that Blondine was trying to embody her. So kind of reading about this 21st century woman who was, like you said, inspired and trying to embody characteristics of this woman from a very different era. It was really fascinating. It definitely, again, like I said, I spent a lot of time on Google because I just wanted to read more, more about it. But yeah, thank you. I realize I haven't said up to this point, but congratulations on winning the Wadstones debut prize. That's so exciting. I guess that must have been amazing. But yeah, would love to hear about that as well. A great time, I think.
Yeah, I mean, that it truly astonished me. I mean, even being on the short list was an honor. And I guess I was just so, when I read out the other people on the short list and I loved their work so much. And so I was genuinely blown away. I didn't know who was going to win it, but I was 100% confident it wasn't me. And then when they announced at the ceremony, I was truly astonished. I think that that kind of, when I was writing this novel, I had written other things that I attempted over the years, a short story collection, a novella, another novel. And I had submitted a couple of those things or portions of things to editors, agents over the years. And a lot of people told me that publishing is very risk averse, and there's never going to be support for an unusual thing. So make sure your first book is safe and make sure it's something that people can immediately pinpoint exactly where it will fit in the market and what it's like and everything like that. And while I don't think that my novel is wildly experimental, I've definitely been exposed to work that's far, far more avant-garde, but it is unconventionally structured. And I knew the characters were so eccentric, the plot was so eccentric, the kind of formal variousness was something that I hadn't seen in many books. Not that it wasn't done before, but it wasn't commonplace. And so when I was finished with this book, I wasn't going to submit it anywhere. I'd received all this advice that you need to make sure your first book is safe. So I decided to, I'd revised it hundreds of times, and I'd been working on it for 5 years. I decided to just print it out and bind it really nicely and put it on my shelf and move on and write something else, write something normal, something less risky. And I tried for months to do that, but I couldn't compromise my interests and aesthetics. It's kind of like, if you're writing literary fiction, what's the point if you're not going to write something that you like? And so my friend Kate Doyle eventually convinced me to submit it to agents. She said, I think that you've received, she said essentially that only one person needs to champion this book and you can find the right fit. And I bet someone's out there for you. And she sent me a list of agents, and I just kind of closed my eyes and gritted my teeth and sent it to some agents that weekend. And after that, things happened very quickly. But I think my shock and sort of this experience of winning this award and receiving all of the support from the UK has been truly astonishing, because it also kind of revives my hope in the industry of publishing and in hand selling, and sort of like, it just proves that readers are far more open-minded and curious and sort of willing to accept things that are relentlessly themselves than I think publishing often gives them credit for. So yeah, it was truly surprising and a real boost.
So it is honestly so amazing to hear that, because again, I remember, I think the entire time I was reading the book, so I do read literary fiction, but I'm very much I read all genres. So I wouldn't say I'm an expert in literary fiction. And I was reading it and I was like, if I had to actually tell somebody what is happening in this book right now, I couldn't really say, but I am loving it. Like, it was so fascinating. It was so hard to put down. And I think, yeah, it was definitely well deserving. I think it's one of those books that kind of, it comes back to me on unexpected moments. I'll be reading parts of other books or having conversations, and I think I have to insert this, like, different parts from the book. Yeah, so it's great. I'm glad that you took the plunge and that you, yeah, just blindly had faith. I think, yeah, it was honestly such an interesting read, and yeah, I keep recommending it anyway. We had some lovely feedback from the read-alongers as well that took part on the Tandem read-along, so yeah, lots of support, which has been lovely to see. But yeah, congrats again. It's amazing. I guess I kind of have to ask before we close as well, if you are planning on a next book, what you're working on at the minute, if you're allowed to tell us anything. Yeah, we'd love to know.
I am working on another novel. It takes place, well, it's due in February, so it's not quite, it may be too early to say, but it's structured as a triptych. It's about 3 different characters, 3 different moments in their lives, who are united by this one event that happens years and years before the book starts. And the first place, the first part of the book takes place in a town that's kind of similar to my hometown. The second takes place in California, in a rural part of California. And yeah, it's kind of interested in multiverse theories and quantum superposition.
Oh, amazing. That sounds fantastic. Yeah, I'm sure everyone will be super, super excited to hear that. I actually just realized, I'm so sorry, I do have another question if you don't mind. I just wanted to actually touch on, obviously the book itself is called the Rabbit Hutch, and the epigram at the beginning of the book is obviously about rabbits. So I just kind of wanted to ask about, ask about that, and I guess that the symbolism and the theme of the rabbits. I'd love to hear a little bit about that before we close up, if that's okay.
Yeah, so I mean, when I had in the very early stages of this book, lots always changes as I write, but the rabbits were there from the beginning. I knew this town had like a rabbit problem. There was this overpopulation of rabbits because all of the kind of natural predators had died, had been killed off, and I had the idea that there was this kind of wonky philanthropist who donated money to make this affordable housing complex built, but he wanted it to sound chic. He didn't want it to sound like a place for, low income residents. He wanted it to sound like this kind of French chic, sophisticated place. So he gave it this kind of absurd French name, La Lapinière, which is like it's not even a commonly used French word. When I was talking to French friends, they were like, what? I've never heard that word before. But it kind of loosely means like rabbit warren or rabbit hutch. And so the residents of the building call it the Rabbit Hutch. But I think I was interested in that because it's one of those things that you sort of write intuitively and then you have to justify it to yourself when you're revising. I'm interested in, I guess I'm drawn to rabbits because they conflict they evoke so many conflicting associations. Like we've got the Easter Bunny and Donnie Darko, and then we have they're pets, but they're also meat. They are sort of, we've got the white rabbit from Alice in Wonderland. They're used in magic tricks. They're the symbol of Playboy. They have this kind of ultimate innocence and then ultimate sort of adult, I suppose, fear and kind of intrigue that we associate with them. And so there are also these kinds of destabilizing forces of chaos in the book. I think anytime you see a rabbit or there's rabbit imagery. And it also made me think about the kind of predator-prey binary. I was always trying to trouble that throughout the book. If someone is ever preying upon another person, I also wanted to see that person being preyed upon, or a force that's preying upon someone also kind of being prey, because I don't think that anyone, kind of like what Father Tim says, I don't think anyone is just one or the other. And so when I had about 100 pages of the book, and then I watched a documentary called Roger and Me by Michael Moore, and it's his kind of ode to Flint, Michigan, which is where he's from, another post-industrial city in the American West that used to manufacture cars, and whose economy was really ravaged by the closure of that company. And there's a woman that he kind of, Michael Moore, the documentarian, sort of stumbles upon as he's driving. He sees a sign. It's like rabbit pets or meat for sale. I think it's something like that. And he talks to her, and she then says the epigraph, which was, let me read it. She says, if you don't sell them as pets, you got to get rid of them as meat. Them guys are all meat, but see, they start doing this to each other. And then she points to the rabbits, and he says, what's that? And she says, peeing on each other and stuff like that when they get older. If you don't have 10 separate cages for them, then they start fighting. Then the males castrate the other males. They do. They chew their balls right off. Then you have a bloody mess. That's why you got to butcher them when they get a certain age, or you have a heck of a mess. And when I heard her say that, it just encapsulated everything that I was trying to capture in this book about sort of in all of this kind of horizontal rage, which is you're really angry at the cage that you're trapped in, but you can't kill the cage. And so where does that anger go? It goes toward the other people, creatures that are surrounding you. So it just seemed like, okay, now the rabbits are definitely staying.
Again, definitely glad that the rabbits did stay. But honestly, thank you so much for joining me this evening, for answering all of those questions. I think it's always lovely to hear from the author and to get some more context on the book. So for anyone who hasn't read it yet, definitely pick up a copy. But thank you again, and I'm sure we all can't wait to see what comes next. So we'll be looking out next February. But
thank you so much for having me. This has been such a pleasure and an honor.
No problem. Thank you so much.